Hi, friends. I would like to pay tribute to Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson Sr. He absolutely inspired my spiritual and social activist journey in this life. I relocated from New York City to Chicago in 1977 and soon connected with the Operation Push movement. PUSH was an acronym for People United to Serve Humanity, and I fully embraced that concept. I like to use the metaphor of transportation vehicles to talk about my time with Reverend Jackson. When I first joined PUSH, it was like being on a moving train. There were multiple stops along the way because Saturday mornings at Operation PUSH were report card mornings. That is to say, we would hear a speech, a motivational speech from Reverend Jackson, where he would bring us up to date on what had transpired from the previous Saturday meeting and where we were with regard to specific activities both in the Chicago region and across the nation, and in fact, even across the world. When I joined PUSH, I found myself working on the issue of the removal, fighting for the removal, that is, of the Krugerrand coin in South Africa. And if you read about that, you will know that that was a coin of great controversy, particularly as it relates to the treatment of the black Africans in South Africa and the kind of work that it required of them to mine that coin. The other broader issue would have been the anti-apartheid movement. Anti-apartheid, you may pronounce it apartheid, but the point of the matter was the dismantling of the apartheid government in South Africa. I found myself captivated by the kinds of speeches that Reverend Jackson made, the motivational speeches to help us to understand and appreciate. As young people, I was relatively young and joined the other students and young women and men, and all age groups actually, who wanted to make a difference in the quality of life of people who were suffering under oppressive regimes and who were determined to find their justice and their freedom in this life. And if not for themselves, certainly for their children and their children's children. So Reverend Jackson would speak in a most wonderful way of using all kinds of metaphors, which is why I'm using the metaphors of transportation vehicles. I'm using the train to talk about the multiple rides and the stops along the way where we were always on a journey. We were moving. There was lots of movement going on at Operation PUSH. And his theological and philosophical speeches were motivating us from Saturday to Saturday to get up and move, stay the course, focus, and be resolved that we can make happen what needs to happen as we seek to help other people overcome their oppressive regimes and the inequities and inequalities that existed in those years, in 1977, in our nation. I went on from teaching in our nation's capital to thereby going on to the seminary to train myself in seminary lifestyle as a woman who would become a minister of Christian education and the gospel of Jesus Christ. That wonderful experience at Princeton Theological Seminary encouraged me because of my field education international experience in Brazil, Fortaleza, in northeast Brazil, very much at the very northeastern tip, if you will, of the continent, actually. And as a result of that experience in Fortaleza, I realized I did actually want to try to see more of the world and to do my part to share and care with peoples of other cultures and other experiences. And so I became a missionary soon after my graduation from Princeton Theological Seminary and began to work with refugees on my very first effort. Actually, it was my second effort when I began to work with refugees, and that captivated me because I could hear the voice of Reverend Jackson saying to me, "Well done, Carol Ann. Press on to do whatever you can for those who are not homeless, but countryless." They don't belong to any country because these refugees with whom I worked were in Thailand. And it was an extraordinary experience with them because they were a family of 5. There was a mother and father and 3 school-age children. And the children had not been educated for a few years because the parents had escaped literally during the night because of religious persecution in their village there in Pakistan. And they were fortunate to become connected with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And I was fortunate to be a missionary that participated with other missionaries that had constructed a school setting and had been able to provide a wonderful curriculum, self-paced and very much suitable to students with very varied kinds of skill levels. And as a result, I thoroughly enjoyed these 3 young Pakistani boys, as well as other students that I had, and followed them closely for a few years until they were successful with their parents in getting from the refugee status and from their time there in Chiang Mai, Thailand. They were able to join family members who had earlier in years, some early, like 20 years earlier, been successful in making their way to Canada. And this precious family found themselves finally, after 9 years of being refugees and living in very dire circumstances, but never discouraged, they found themselves successful in getting all of the particular resources and everything that was urgently needed in place. And they relocated to Canada. And now, let me tell you, they have been there long enough to become naturalized Canadian citizens with all the rights and privileges thereof. I followed them a year and a half after they had relocated to Canada and found that those 3 students that I supported and helped every step of the way that I could in my time there in Thailand had in fact become highly motivated to go on to college and were pursuing nursing degrees. Thank you, Reverend Jackson, for making an indelible impression upon my life early on and I finding myself doing some things that I pray have made all the difference in human lives, those that I was able to touch, and specifically in the lives of these refugee families.